I'm Drew, and I'm an amateur model builder. I'm building a layout in my basement called the White River Line, inspired by the Frisco Railroad in the Ozarks. So in this episode, I'm going to be working on the gondola car that I started in the last episode. I'm going to be working on paint and weathering, and this video is going to be my entry into the Down and Dirty Weathering Contest hosted by John over at JC's Rip Track. You can find more information about this contest up in the upper left-hand corner, as well as down in the description below. So let's go ahead and jump into it. I started with a light gray primer on all of the parts. I picked up an old and new wood effects kit from Vallejo for this project, thanks to a gift card from my in-laws for my birthday. While I've used some of these techniques in the past, this kit greatly expands on the number of shades I have available to me for simulating weathered wood. I started by lightly and unevenly airbrushing the wood sections of the model with concrete. For the next step, I cut out a stencil for the stakes on the gondola sides. I airbrushed individual boards with IDF light sand and light brown, masking the stakes with the stencil I'd made and the edges with an index card. I also went back and brush painted individual boards. I don't really have good enough skill with an airbrush to individually paint detail this small. All of this is done to create some variety in the coloring of the boards. Next, I added a dark gray wash diluted 50-50 with water to bring out the wood grain. I was pretty much done with the work on the bed of the car at this point. I will be filling the gondola with gravel, and I was painting it mostly just to experiment and practice. Focusing on the sides, I used some Vallejo sand to highlight the edges of the boards. Then I dry brushed them a bit with golden brown. I added one final wash, a mix of 3 drops of dark gray and 1 drop of golden brown and 3 drops of tap water. I applied a matte varnish to protect this work, and then I referred to some of the prototype pictures to get a good idea of how to structure the chipping. The first is a black and white photo of a Frisco gondola car from 1910. The car looks pretty much new here, so not much inspiration for weathering, but it's good to have some idea of the placement for the paint scheme. I also found some heavily weathered wooden gondolas from here in Colorado, from the Denver and Rio Grande and the Colorado Southern. These provide some great inspiration for the weathering of the wood sides. They are in considerably worse shape than I am planning to weather. Obviously the wood itself is much darker, and I don't plan to remove quite this much paint in my chipping process. One other thing to notice is that the metal components retain their paint much better than the wooden components. Although I considered salt chipping, I'll be using Vallejo chipping medium. I used a regular brush instead of an airbrush to apply the chipping medium to have a little more control. Once this was done, I moved on to finishing the assembly on the model. Well, except for the trucks and wheels. I chose to wait until after applying the underpainting to attach the side, so it'd be easier to paint these parts. However, I wanted to do this bit of assembly before applying the main color to the model, and I'll demonstrate why in just a second. I used styrene cement here, but only applied it to the underside of the stake pockets. Styrene cement can wreak havoc on paint. Then I applied the panels on the ends of the cars. Here I used CA glue, knowing I wouldn't have too much hidden space to apply the styrene cement. I'd recently picked up some CA glue accelerant to try out. This is used with some of the slower acting CA glues. The idea being that you have some working time to get the part in place, and then once you have it there, spray it with accelerant to reduce the time you have to hold the pieces in place. Next, I clip wires for the torsion rods using the template on the instructions. Then I installed them. They were a little short, so I probably won't use the template next time. I'll just clip them to the length, measuring them on the model. Here's why I chose to glue this up before painting my main color. My gluing skills are a little sloppy. Doing this now will allow the paint to make up for my sloppiness a little. Whereas if I'd waited, I just need to do touch-up afterwards. I mixed up my standard boxcar red, 2 parts Russian Air Force dark green, and 1 part fire red. I built up thin layers using my airbrush until I was satisfied with my coverage. After drying overnight, I then started the chipping on the paint. I used a variety of tools for chipping, including a stiff brush, a micro brush, and a small bamboo skewer. But mostly, I used a simple toothpick. Once I was satisfied with this result, I moved on to decals. I'd bought a set of gondola decals from K4 Decals, but I quickly realized they were too big for this gondola. They were based on a larger sized, modern gondola. So I had to go into problem solving mode. For the Frisco Herald, I figured I could just make some stencils. I printed out the lettering, and then I used Super 77 to adhere to some cardstock. Then I went to work cutting out the stencils. I taped the stencils to the car and painted them white, using kind of a stippling technique. This worked well and had the advantage of not needing to distress the lettering too much afterwards. I grabbed some boxcar decals and figured I could modify them a bit to work. They're barely legible after weathering, so I didn't figure it mattered too much if the information wasn't quite correct. Besides, I couldn't find a Frisco prototype that exactly matched this car design anyway. I applied a gloss coat to the areas where I was going to apply the decals beforehand, using a 50-50 mix of Revive It and isopropyl alcohol. I applied them with my standard procedure. Place the decal in water, prep the surface with microset, place the decal, and follow up with microsol as needed. After letting the decals set overnight, I applied a brush coat of matte varnish and distressed the decals with a sanding stick and a mini bamboo skewer. Then I turned my attention to the underframe. I generally don't do too much work on the underframe, keeping to the adage, don't model what you don't see. And you don't really see the undercarriage when the car is running or displayed. I applied a somewhat murky boxcar red to the bottom using my airbrush, adding some dark gray and some Russian Air Force dark green to my standard boxcar mix. The coat is uneven, and a little bit of overspray on the side sills isn't really a problem. It adds to the weathering effect. I then turned my attention to some other details. In a lack of foresight, I failed to add any chipping medium to the platforms on the end of the car. I guess I wasn't thinking about the fact that the sides don't extend that far, so I needed to do some weathering there as well. I used pretty much the same technique I used for the weathered wood underpainting. These areas would be pretty weathered since water would sit on them and workers would wear away the surface getting on and off the car. As I was working on this, I decided that boxcar red on top of the car was a little too even and crisp, so I did a little light fading there. I've seen other modelers use oil pen washes for fading, but I don't have any oils. I lightened some boxcar red with white and dry brushed it on selectively with a 3/0 brush. In some cases the edges were a little too crisp using this technique, so I softened them with a toothpick. I then added a bit of brown iron oxide dry pigment to a few places on the undercarriage that are generally visible, and a few other metal components on the top part as well. I then applied a matte varnish to the car to protect my work. Next, I applied a dark wash of Russian Air Force dark green and dark gray, thinned considerably with water. In one final detail, I added the dark gray wash to all the bolt heads on the sides of the car. I then turned my attention to the trucks and wheels. I assembled the wheels and sprayed the assembly with primer. Now, I've got to admit, I really struggle with trucks and wheels and the underframe. I don't have my procedure quite down for this yet, so it's a work in progress. I painted all but the inside of the wheels with dark gray. This is an airbrush paint, so it takes a couple of coats, and it is a little uneven painting with the brush, but it won't matter much with the other painting I'm going to do. I followed this up with a very heavy dry brushing of a mix of chocolate brown and burnt red. It was a little too bright, so I added a bit of Tamiya flat black. Next, I dry brushed a mix of cement and white, very, very lightly. On the inside of the wheels, I mixed up some Tamiya black and brown iron oxide pigment. In addition to modifying the color, the pigment adds texture. When this was all dry, I used the back of an X-Acto blade to remove the paint from the outside of the wheels. Now, it is time for final assembly. I used some Woodland Scenic's light gray fine ballast for the load of gravel in the car. Once I got it to the shape and profile that I wanted, I wet it with isopropyl alcohol and set it with a 50-50 mix of white glue and water. The final step was to airbrush some dark earth to the underframe and the bottom portion of the sides to simulate dirt and dust. With this, the model is complete. Thanks for joining me on this episode. I'm pretty happy with how this model turned out, and I think it's going to make a great addition to my layout, servicing the cement factory from the quarry. And I'm pretty excited to get it entered into the Down and Dirty Weathering Contest. Now you can find me on Facebook and Instagram, and you can find those links below in the description, along with all the materials and supplies that I use in my modeling. In my next episode, I'm actually going back to the Ozarks to visit my parents for the week, and I'm going to show you some of the places that inspired my love of trains around the area. So join me next time as we continue building the White River Line.